coup, a revolution, a bring, a genocide, a new world.
The MKUltra experiment, the CIA dosed unwitting subjects with LSD to see how they would react. What has not yet come to light is that MKUltra was an intra-agency project. The CIA created new departments within the CIA and fed them steady doses of LSD and other psychoactives to see how the departments would diverge and mutate away from normal departments. Whole projects and hierarchies were created, with everybody involved being, more or less, unwittingly under the influence of LSD. And this is how the first bed restraint portals and flesh interfaces were created, i.e., from a heavily psychomutated hierarchy. The entire thing had to be eliminated, but the technology it created has been revolutionary. In Vietnam, the US government tried to pacify the country village by village using the Strategic Hamlet Program, basically creating villages where there is no to little Viet Cong influence. They tried more extreme experiments where they completely isolated villages or groups of villages, allowing absolutely nobody to enter for periods of up to 4 years. In some villages, people simply starved to death. In other, more self-sufficient villages, the people managed to scrape by. It was noted that in many of the villages where this technique was tried, Messianic or Malarian movements sprang up. In 16 separate incidences, villagers were able to independently invent flesh interfaces and non-electric portals. And it was surmised that these villages were being collectively dosed with LSD for long periods of time, and their intellectual mutations allowed for these advances. The flesh interfaces were eventually destroyed by the North Vietnamese army at a terrible cost in lives.
I'm surprised they used nuclear subs in the Falklands, considering the battle's proximity to the undersea incident zone surrounding the so-called Arcticus portal. As I understand it, the portal was opened because of experiments taking place in the CIA's Antarctic station in the early 80s, and Falklands quickly became a center for portal research. Being underwater, the portal had an enormous incident zone, and segmented whales and other undersea debris would regularly wash up on the island's shores. They found one whale that had been segmented cleanly in half by an incident zone disturbance, proving a perfect cross section of the creature. They also found hundreds of the chitinous cruciform creatures, certainly non terrestrial in origin. Anyways, if a nuclear sub had wandered into the incident zone, it could have been disastrous, but I guess they considered the risk acceptable.
The Soviets designated large portions of the Ukraine countryside as harvest populations. Basically, their food and water supplies were dosed with LSD until they had achieved what the Soviets called integration. This meant that the local populations had independently invented flesh interfaces. The Soviet army would then quarantine the area and try to remove the flesh interfaces for their own use. This was usually without success, and with a great loss of life. Many of the soldiers and scientists were segmented, as often happens in an incident zone, so they ended up with people missing limbs, cut in half, etc. What's interesting is that people could live for quite some time despite segmentation. This is what led the Soviets to believe that their missing body parts still existed, albeit in some unknown place. So, one of the leading theories of the time was interdimensionality. Quite mistaken. Dubai probably has the highest rate of free-floating non-interface incidents of any major metropolitan area in the world. In one incident, a large group of migrant workers were segmented in an underground facility. Perfect cross-sectional segmentation along the frontal plane. You could see their lungs working, food being digested,
blood pumping on the inside of the heart, everything. He lived for almost 5 months in this condition. Absolutely fascinating to see in person. There was also a group of school children who were very lightly segmented, just the ends of fingers and bits of calves and such, hardly fatal wounds. Yet they all died within 2 months. Some showed signs of intellectual mutation. There were no known flesh interfaces in Dubai. However, it is surmised that the architecture is actually based on interface geometry and carries some latent interface-like power. Mass segmentations remain one of the most mysterious aspects of the interfaces. They seem to show that the interfaces indeed do concentrate on flesh, living up to their name. We look at Elizabeth Bathory as an example of pre-LSD enlightenment, i.e., somebody seeming to attempt to build a flesh interface before the invention of LSD. How can this be explained? Perhaps she ingested some ergot or some naturally occurring psychotropic chemical. Perhaps her mind was simply attuned to whatever intellectual process is needed to invent a flesh interfaces. The Book of Revelations is also considered to be a description of a flesh interface, especially the description of New Jerusalem. My problem with all of this is that it is speculative. It's like when modern psychologists diagnose historical figures. I'm uncomfortable with this level of speculation. I will always regard the first instance of a flesh interface to occurred in Treblinka, 1944. The geologic disturbances, partial tunnels, so-called interdimensionality, and a wealth of clearly segmented bodies leave no doubt of its existence. The Soviets have documented this. Basically, when you look at the stories of Elizabeth Bathory's behavior, it seems like she was trying to build a flesh interface. But it is known that in order to invent a flesh interface, one must be under the influence of LSD for extended periods. As LSD hadn't been invented during her life, it's probably just a coincidence. Still a tantalizing theory, though.
Obviously, I can't define a flesh interface in terms of purpose or composition or mechanism. I can only list the various phenomena which are related to them. Chief among these is the creation of an incident zone, wherein objects are spontaneously segmented, i.e., parts of objects simply disappear, yet the objects continue to behave as if the missing parts are still present. Also, you see complex tunnels created in the earth. These have been termed ant farms. In undersea interfaces, you get chitinous cruciform organisms. These sui generis organisms are thought to be the result of evolutionary processes which took place in an environment other than Earth. This is speculation, but in this case, I agree with it. Then, there have been the giant metallic cylinders, which appear and experience continuous, spontaneous segmentation. There are usually at least 10 meters in diameter and get much larger, and only occur in very large interfaces, i.e. portals. Beyond this, the phenomena are too various to mention, and different for each interface. Many people think that a portal is simply a large interface. This is true. A portal is a large flesh interface, but it's also more than that. A portal, as the name implies, is a way of sending objects between the portal site and wherever the various locations that have been found beyond the portals are located, i.e. the so-called alien sister cities. Portals are usually, but not always, accompanied by the large, fluctuating metallic cylinders. The largest above-water portal that I know of occurred in Novaya Zemlya and existed for several weeks before it was destroyed by the Russian so-called Tsar Bomba. In this case, the metallic cylinders were miles high and covered with features rarely seen on other cylinders: blinking lights, nodules, so-called antennae. They took on a very artificial appearance, i.e. they seemed to be constructed technology rather than naturally occurring phenomena. Are the cylinders themselves artifacts being sent through the portals? Or are they phenomena created by the flesh interfaces in a way a mushroom cloud is created by a nuclear explosion? This was unclear. I wish I could show you guys the pictures of Novaya Zemlya cylinders. They truly were beautiful, rising miles into the clear Arctic air like great alien towers, tinged blue by the vastness of the distance involved. Though it was certainly necessary to destroy them, and we owe the Soviets a great debt for their tireless efforts to collapse the interface. Sometimes I wish they were still there. At least then, there would be something, some evidence. In response to what the CIA had accomplished with their Antarctic stations in Arcturus, the Soviets built a larger station in Novaya Zemlya in the Arctic. 30,000 prisoners and an exceptionally pure gas concentration created a flesh interface, which went through all 7 stages in less than 13 minutes and became a full-fledged portal. Within a day, the typical fluctuating metallic cylinders were visible, and within 3 days, they were extending miles into the sky. Soviets quickly realized that the portal was growing out of control. In previous instances, it simply bombed the site from the air. But in this case, the enormous cylinders and attendant incident zone extending to the edge of space prevented this, as well as missile strikes. There was also an exceptionally large incident zone around the portal, with segmentation occurring miles out from the site. Alarmed by the zone's uncontrolled growth and the growing underground tunnels, the Soviets worked feverishly to construct a hydrogen bomb of unprecedented power, which could be detonated from outside the incident zone and still collapse the portal. The steady rate of growth in the incident zone provided them with an exact deadline, which they managed to meet with only 2 hours to spare. Any later, and the bomb could not have been placed as to so collapse the interface. In short, the world came within 2 hours being subjugated to an uncontrolled flesh interface, and perhaps the end of civilization as we know it. Before the portal was collapsed, however, the Soviets had gained first-hand knowledge of the so-called sister cities. In other words, somebody had gone into the portal and come back.